My father was still warm in the ground when my husband's mother walked into the attorney's office and handed over a document I had never seen before. I was sitting 3 chairs away, still wearing my black dress from the burial, still holding a tissue I had cried through twice. And she placed that paper on the table like she had been waiting her whole life for that moment. The attorney looked at it, then he looked at me. And in that one look, I understood that something had been done to me long before my father ever got sick. I just had not known it yet. Before I tell you what that document said, I need to ask you something. If the people closest to you, the ones you cooked for, defended, welcomed into your family, had been quietly working against you for years, would you want to know all at once or piece by piece? Because I got it piece by piece. And every piece hurt more than the last. Stay with me, because by the end of this, you are going to feel something. And I want to know in the comments whether you think what I did was enough or whether you would have gone further. My name is Emily, and I am going to tell you the story of how I lost my father, nearly lost everything he left me, and then quietly, carefully, and completely took it all back. I want to start at the end of something because that is where the truth started for me. My father, Gerald, passed away on a Tuesday in October. It was not sudden. He had been sick for 2 years, and I had spent most of those 2 years driving 4 hours round trip every single weekend to sit with him, cook for him, manage his medications, argue with his doctors, hold his hand during the bad nights, and make sure he did not feel alone. I did all of that while working full-time, while managing a household, and while being a wife to a man named Daniel, whose family I had folded my whole heart into for 7 years. I tell you this not to make myself sound noble, I tell you this because it matters. What a person gives matters, where a person's time goes matters, and the people around you always know better than you think exactly what you're giving and exactly how to use it. My father was not a wealthy man in the way that word usually sounds. He was not a millionaire, he did not have a yacht or a vacation house, but he had lived quietly and carefully for 68 years. He owned a house outright, a small house on a corner lot in the town where I grew up, with a yard he had mowed himself every Saturday until his knees gave out. He had a savings account he had been putting money into since before I was born. He had a small life insurance policy. And he had a storage unit full of things he called family things: furniture, jewelry, documents, and one locked metal box he had told me about exactly once, in a quiet moment during his second month of illness. He said, "Emily, there is a box in the back of that unit. The key is in the Bible on my nightstand. Don't let anyone open it before you do." I nodded. I wrote it down in my phone. I did not think too much about it at the time, because at that point I still believed I was surrounded by people who would never do something that required a locked box to stop them. I was wrong about that. I was wrong in a way that took me months to fully understand. The first strange thing happened the week my father went into hospice. I had been the one managing everything: his bills, his mail, his bank, his appointments. Daniel knew this, his mother Patricia knew this, his sister Renee knew this. They had all watched me do it. They had all said at various points things like, "You are such a good daughter, Emily, and Gerald is so lucky to have you, and you go will hold things down here." Those sentences, I would later realize, were not compliments. They were measurements. They were Patricia cataloging exactly how distracted I was and exactly how long she had. In the week my father entered hospice, Daniel told me that his mother had offered to help with the paperwork. I remember being so exhausted that I said, "What paperwork?" And he said, "Just some of the legal preparation. She knows a guy." I remember thinking that was kind. I remember feeling grateful. I remember saying, "Tell her thank you." That sentence is one I have replayed in my mind many, many times since. My father died 11 days later. The hospice nurse called me at 6:14 in the morning. I drove to the facility alone because Daniel said he had an early work call he could not move. I sat with my father's body for an hour before anyone else arrived. I held his hand. I talked to him. I told him I loved him and that I was proud to be his daughter and that I was going to be okay. I did not know yet what had already been done. The funeral was small. My father had not been a man with many friends left. Most of them had gone before him, the way it happens when you reach a certain age. There was me, Daniel, Patricia, Renee, a cousin of my father's named Harold W.H. O drove up from 3 states away, and a few neighbors who had known my father for decades. Patricia sat in the front row with Daniel and kept reaching over to pat my hand in a way that felt, even then, slightly performative, like she was playing a role for an audience I could not see. 3 days after the burial, we went to the attorney's office. I want you to understand what I expected to happen in that room. I expected to hear my father's will read, to receive confirmation that the house and the savings and the insurance policy were being transferred to me as his only child, to sign some paperwork, and to begin the slow process of grieving a man I had loved completely. That is what I expected. What actually happened was this. We sat down. The attorney, a man named Mr. Fielding who I had never met before, looked around the room and then said, "I see we have everyone, good." I remember thinking it was slightly odd that he said everyone as if he had been expecting the whole group, but I pushed that thought aside. He opened a folder, he said my father's name, he said the date, and then he began reading from a document that I slowly, with growing horror, realized I had never seen before in my life. The will that Mr. Fielding read that day was not the will I had helped my father prepare 18 months earlier. The will I knew about, the one we had gone to a different attorney to sign, the one where my father left me the house, the savings, and all personal property, was not the document in that folder. The document Mr. Fielding read left the house to Daniel, not to me, to Daniel, my husband, listed as the primary beneficiary. The savings account was to be divided between Daniel and Patricia in recognition of support rendered during Gerald's illness. The personal property and the contents of the storage unit were listed as going to the estate to be distributed at the executor's discretion. The executor named in this document was Patricia. I sat in that chair and I could not speak. The cousin Harold looked at me across the table with an expression I will never forget. It was not surprise. It was pity, deep, quiet pity, the kind that meant he already knew something was wrong and had known before he even sat down. Patricia did not look at me at all. Daniel looked at his phone. I finally said, "That is not my father's will." My voice came out smaller than I wanted it to. I said it again, louder. "That is not the will my father signed. I was there when he signed it." Mr. Fielding looked at me with the careful expression of a man who has seen this before and does not enjoy it. He said the document had been filed 6 weeks prior. He said it bore my father's signature and had been witnessed and notarized. 6 weeks prior, 6 weeks before my father died, during the period when he was in hospice, during the period when Patricia had offered to help with the paperwork, during the period when I had been so consumed with grief and exhaustion that I had said, "Tell her thank you." I stood up from that table, I picked up my bag. I looked at Daniel, my husband of 7 years, the man I had loved and trusted and defended and chosen. He was still looking at his phone, and I walked out of that office and sat in my car in the parking lot and did not cry. I did not cry because something in me had gone very, very cold, and cold things do not cry, they calculate. The drive home was 40 minutes. I used every one of them. I called my father's original attorney from the car, the one who had helped us draft his real will 18 months ago. His name was Mr. Castillo, and he was a small, precise man who had been practicing law for 30 years. I got his voicemail. I left a message that was measured and clear and gave him the basic facts. I said there was a competing document and I needed to speak with him as soon as possible. Then I called Harold. Harold answered on the second ring. He said, "Emily, I have been waiting for you to call." That sentence hit me somewhere deep. I asked him what he knew. He was quiet for a moment and then he said, "I don't know everything, but your daddy called me about 5 weeks ago. He said someone had been coming to see him at the hospice. He said he was confused about some papers. He said he had signed something, but he wasn't sure what it was." My father had been confused. He had been medicated for pain. He had been alone during one of those visits because I had been at work, and someone had brought papers for a dying, medicated man to sign. I want to pause here and let that sit with you, because I need you to feel what I felt in that moment. My father had called his cousin from his hospice bed, confused and unsettled about papers he had signed, and that cousin had not called me because he had not wanted to upset me during an already devastating time. And the people who had brought those papers had counted on exactly that, on everyone being too sad, too gentle, too considerate to make noise. In time. They had used my love for my father against me. They had used everyone's love and grief and careful consideration as a weapon, and they had almost gotten away with it completely. Almost. I got home before Daniel. I went to my bedroom and I found my copy of the original will. I had kept a copy. My father had given me one the day we signed it, and I had filed it in the folder where I kept all important documents. The date on my copy was 18 months earlier. The signature was my father's. The witnesses were 2 employees of Mr. Castillo's office. The document left everything, the house, the savings, the personal property, all of it to me, Emily, his daughter. I photographed every page of that document. I sent the photos to my personal email. I sent them to my cloud storage. I texted them to myself. And then I put the original back in the folder, locked the filing cabinet, put the key in my coat pocket, and went downstairs to start making dinner as if nothing in my world had just detonated. Because here is something I understood in my bones in that moment. I was still in the same house as a man whose family had just tried to steal my inheritance. I did not know yet how much Daniel knew or when he had known it. I did not know the full shape of what had been done. And I knew that the worst thing I could do was show my hand before I knew what cards I was actually holding. So I made dinner, I set the table, and when Daniel came home and sat across from me, I asked him how his day was, and he told me, and we ate, and I watched his face across that table and I thought, "I do not know you." I thought I did, but I do not know you at all. Mr. Castillo called me back the next morning. I took the call in my car in the parking lot of my office where no one could hear me. He asked me to describe what had happened. I told him everything. He was quiet in the careful way that lawyers get quiet when something is serious. Then he said, "Emily, I need to see that document they presented, and I need you to bring me your copy of the original." I asked him what he thought we were dealing with. He said, at minimum, undue influence, potentially fraud, possibly elder abuse under the statutes given your father's medical state at the time of signing. He also said something else. He said, Emily, do not sign anything, do not agree to anything, do not move out of that house or give up access to anything your father owned, not yet. I told him I had not planned to. He said, good, I need you to also think about whether there is any other documentation, anything that might confirm your father's actual wishes, in his own words, from around the time of his illness. That is when I remembered the box, the locked metal box in the storage unit, the key and the Bible on my father's nightstand. The Bible was still at the hospice facility. They had told me I could come collect my father's personal items anytime within the next 2 weeks. I had not gone yet because I had not been able to make myself go back to that room, but now I had a reason. I left work early that day. I drove to the hospice. I went to my father's old room, which had already been cleaned and reset for whoever would need it next. A nurse brought me a plastic bag with my father's belongings, his watch, his reading glasses, his slippers, a small photo of me at maybe 8 years old that he had kept on the bedside table, and the Bible. I opened it in the car. The key was there, taped to the inside back cover exactly where he had put it. My hands were shaking. I want to be honest about that. I sat in that parking lot and I pressed my hands flat against my thighs and I breathed until they stopped. Then I drove to the storage unit. The unit was still in my father's name. I still had the access code. I went in, moved past the furniture, past the boxes of old dishes and linens, past the coat rack that had stood in our front hallway my entire childhood. In the very back on a metal shelf was the box, gray metal, about the size of a shoebox. The key worked on the first try. Inside the box there were 4 things. The first was my father's original birth certificate and his military discharge papers from decades before I was born. The second was a savings bond from the early 1980s that I had not known about. The third was a handwritten letter, 3 pages long, dated 8 weeks before his death, written during the period before the hospice, when he was still at home and lucid and clear. The fourth thing was a recording. A small digital voice recorder, the kind a person buys at an electronics store to record notes to themselves. There was a piece of masking tape on it with my name written in my father's handwriting. Emily. I did not play it there. I put everything back in the box, locked it, put it in my trunk under a blanket, and drove home. I sat in my driveway for 20 minutes before I went inside. I played the recording that night after Daniel fell as leap with earbuds in the bathroom with the door locked and the shower running for noise. My father's voice came through the speaker, and I had to press my fist against my mouth to keep from making a sound. He said, Emily, if you're hearing this, something happened that I was worried about. I'm going to say some things that are hard and I need you to listen. A few weeks ago, Patricia came to see me here at home. She came alone without Daniel. She brought a man with her who she said was a financial advisor. He had papers for me to sign. I signed some of them because I was tired and I didn't read everything the way I should have. After they left, I started feeling like something was wrong. I called Harold and I talked to a woman at the senior center who does legal advice. She said I needed to write down what happened and save it, so that's what I'm doing. Patricia has been talking to me for 2 years about what should happen to my house. She said it should stay in the family, meaning Daniel's family. I told her it was going to Emily. She said there were better ways to protect the asset. I didn't fully understand what she meant. Emily, if something happens to my house and my money that you didn't expect, I want you to know I did not choose that. I want you to have what I always meant for you to have. You were there, you were always there. That matters more than any paper anyone else got me to sign. I love you, my girl, fight for it. He said fight for it. My father, a gentle man who never raised his voice, who mowed his own lawn until his knees gave out, who put savings bonds in a locked box for a future he hoped his daughter would have. He looked at whatever was happening around him and he said, fight for it. I did not sleep that night. The next morning, I contacted Mr. Castillo and told him about the box. He told me to bring everything to his office immediately and to touch nothing else, move nothing else, and tell no one. I did not tell Daniels. I told him I had a dentist appointment. I drove to Mr. Castillo's office and I spread the contents of that box on his conference table and I played him the recording. He listened with his eyes closed and his hands folded on the table. When it ended, he sat still for a long moment. Then he said, Emily, this is significant. He said the recording, combined with the original will, combined with Harold's account of the phone call from my father, and combined with the timing of the competing document, gave us a credible case for multiple legal challenges. He said we were looking at a will contest, a potential fraud claim, and depending on what we could establish about the nature of that visit and those signatures, possibly a report to the state's Adult Protective Services regarding elder financial abuse. He also said, I need you to think very carefully about what happens when you file this. Your husband will know, his mother will know. Are you prepared for that? I thought about my father sitting in his house while Patricia walked in with a man and a stack of papers. I thought about the hospice nurse calling me at 6:14 in the morning. I thought about Daniel looking at his phone in that attorney's office while the wrong will was being read. I thought about 7 years of cooking and loving and defending and choosing. I said, yes, I'm prepared. What happened next happened in two tracks at the same time. On the legal track, Mr. Castillo filed a formal contest of the second will, citing undue influence and the question of my father's capacity at the time of signing. He sent a formal legal notice to Mr. Fielding and to Patricia in her role as named executor. He also made a report to Adult Protective Services regarding the circumstances of the signing. On the personal track, I came home that evening, sat across from Daniel at dinner, and said nothing at all. I listened to him talk about his day, I passed him the bread, I asked if he wanted more water, and I understood in a way I had not let myself understand before that the man across from me had known. He had to have known. Patricia did not act without Daniel's knowledge. They were too close, too coordinated, too prepared in that attorney's office. The way he had looked at his phone while that false will was being read, that was not indifference. That was the practiced calm of someone who had already known the outcome and had already decided not to look at me while it landed. I started keeping notes. Every conversation, every date, every small thing he said about the estate, about the house, about his mother, I kept them in a notebook I stored in my locker at work. I told my closest friend, Diane, what was happening. She was the first person outside of Harold and Mr. Castillo who knew. She sat with me in her kitchen for 4 hours one Saturday while I went through everything from the beginning. At the end, she said, Emily, you have to get out of that house before any legal decisions are made about it. That had not occurred to me yet, but she was right. Meanwhile, Mr. Castillo's legal notice had landed. Patricia called Daniel the same day it arrived. I know this because I was in the next room and I heard his voice change, that particular drop in tone that happens when a phone call becomes serious. I did not walk in, I stayed where I was. 15 minutes later, he came and found me and said, my mother got a letter from an attorney. He said it carefully, like he was testing the air. I said, okay. He said, do you know anything about that? I looked at him, I said, I know a lot of things, Daniel, which part specifically? He stared at me, then he said, we need to talk about the estate. I said, we do, I'll have my attorney contact you. The look on his face in that moment, I had never seen it before. It was the look of someone who has made a calculation that suddenly does not add up. He had calculated that I would be too grief-stricken, too trusting, too gentle, too invested in keeping the peace to fight. He had calculated that I would sign what needed to be signed and cry quietly and eventually accept what had been taken. That calculation had been wrong, and he was only now beginning to understand how wrong. That night he slept in the guest room, his choice. 3 days later, Patricia called me directly. I let it go to voicemail. Her message was remarkable. Her voice was warm, the way warm can sound when it is not warm at all, the way it sounds when it is a hand reaching for something while smiling. She said she was worried about me. She said she wanted to sit down together as a family. She said she hoped I understood that Gerald had made his own decisions and that she had only been trying to help. She said she hoped we could all get through this together. I played that voicemail for Mr. Castillo. He said, good, keep it, do not delete it. He said her phrasing, Gerald had made his own decisions, was actually useful to us because it confirmed she had been present for and involved in the process. He said it revealed more than she intended it to. The Adult Protective Services report triggered an investigation. An investigator contacted the hospice to review the visitor logs during my father's stay. Patricia had visited 4 times during the hospice period, twice with a man who had signed in as a financial consultant. During those visits, I had not been present. My name was not listed in the visitor log alongside those dates. I had been at work, or driving, or sitting in a parking lot crying, because I had believed that the people around me were simply holding things down the way they had promised. The hospice had a policy about patients signing documents during their stay. It required a capacity assessment and a witness who was not a beneficiary. Neither of those things had happened on the relevant date. The notarized signatures had been obtained in my father's home before the hospice, but only just during the window when his confusion was already documented in his medical records as a noted symptom of his illness and his pain medication. His primary care physician, when contacted by the investigator, confirmed that at the time the competing will was signed, my father was on a medication regimen that required careful assessment before any legal documents could be considered binding. The case was building. I want to tell you about Renee, Daniel's sister, because her role in all of this was something I did not expect. Renee had always been the quieter one in that family. She watched more than she talked. She had a daughter in elementary school and a job she loved and a life that did not seem especially interested in drama. I had always liked Renee. I had thought honestly that she liked me too. About 6 weeks into the legal process, Renee reached out to me by text. She said she needed to talk to me privately. We met at a coffee shop on a side street, one neither of us usually went to. She came in looking like she had not slept. She sat down and she wrapped both hands around her coffee cup and she said, Emily, I didn't know she was going to do this. I want you to know that. I found out the same week the letter came. I believed her. I still believe her. because what she said next was not something someone says when they are trying to protect the other side. She said, "My mother has been talking about Gerald's house for 2 years. She talked about it like it was already decided, like it was already going to be part of the family. I didn't know she had done something legal. I thought she was just talking the way she talks." She paused, then she said, "There's something else. A few months ago, I heard her on a phone call. She was talking about putting the house in her name, not Daniel's. She said Daniel was better used in other ways. I didn't know what that meant at the time. I do now. This was new. This was a crack in a wall I had not known was there. I called Mr. Castillo that same afternoon and told him Hat Renee had said he asked if she would be willing to provide a written statement. She gave it the following week. In it, she described the 2-year pattern of Patricia's conversation about the house, the phone call she had overheard, and her own assessment of her mother's intentions and habits. It was not a legal slam dunk on its own, but it was another thread, and we were building a tapestry. Daniel and I were still living in the same house at this point, which was deeply strange. We moved around each other like two people in a building that had been condemned but not yet vacated. He was quiet, I was quiet. He stopped asking questions about the legal process, which told me he was now getting his information from Patricia's attorney. He ate breakfast early and left before I was fully awake most mornings. He came home late. On the nights we were both home in the evening, he watched television and I read. We were like two strangers who had once known each other and now could not figure out how to say goodbye. I was not heartbroken in the way I might have expected. That surprised me. I think I had already been grieving Daniel for a while without realizing it. The moment in the attorney's office, the phone he had stared at, the guest room he had chosen, those were not the first moments of a man becoming a stranger. They were just the first moments I had been still enough and honest enough with myself to see it clearly. My attorney contacted Daniel's attorney. The legal conversation was now formally separated from the personal one. That helped. It gave the situation edges. I knew what I was dealing with in one room, even if the other room was still strange and sad and complicated. The will contest hearing was scheduled for 3 months out. In the meantime, Mr. Castillo filed for a temporary restraining order on any transfer of my father's assets, the house, the savings account, the insurance payout, all of it pending the resolution of the contest. The order was granted, nothing could move. Patricia could not sell the house, she could not access the savings, she could not do anything with the storage unit. Everything was frozen, exactly as it had been when my father was alive. I visited the storage unit twice during that period, once to sit with the furniture and let myself cry in private, which I needed to do and had not done enough of. Once to take the photo of 8-year-old me from the box of personal items because I wanted it, because it was mine, because my father had kept it by his bed. In the second month, something unexpected happened. The financial consultant who had been present during the visits to my father, his name had been logged at my father's home address by a neighbor who had noticed the car twice, a neighbor who had known my father for 20 years and had been paying attention in the way that good neighbors sometimes do. Mr. Castillo tracked him down. He was not, it turned out, a licensed financial advisor. He was a notary public who also described himself as an estate planning facilitator. He had no formal qualifications in estate law. He had been hired by Patricia through a referral from someone in her social circle. When the Adult Protective Services investigator contacted him, he became, in a very short period of time, deeply cooperative. He stated that he had been told the family wanted to update the document and that the patient had agreed. He stated that he had asked the patient 1 or 2 questions to confirm awareness and had received what seemed like coherent answers. He stated that he had not known about the existing will on file with a licensed attorney. He stated that he was very sorry. His statement was added to our file. Patricia retained a formal estate attorney of her own at this point. The warm voicemails stopped. The request to sit down as a family stopped. The language shifted to formal correspondence between legal teams, which honestly was a relief. The warmth had always cost me something. The formality, at least, was honest. And then came the family group chat moment, which I have to tell you about because it is the kind of thing that sounds too on the nose to be real, and yet it happened exactly this way. There was a family group chat on Daniel's side. I had been in it for years, birthdays, holidays, general chatter. Patricia had added me herself when Daniel and I got married. After the legal process began, the chat went very quiet whenever I might be reading. Topics shifted to safe, innocuous things, recipes, a cousin's new job, the weather in their hometown. One Sunday evening, I got a message. It was from Patricia. It was clearly meant for Daniel. It said, "She won't get anything. Fielding says the recording won't hold up. Harold can't prove anything and nobody's going to believe some dying man's note over a notarized signature. Tell your sister to stop talking to her or this whole thing falls apart." Patricia had sent it to the wrong person. And she had sent it to the whole group chat. I screenshotted it before anyone could delete it. 20 seconds later, the message disappeared. 30 seconds after that, Daniel sent a message to the chat saying, "Wrong thread, ignore that." But I had it. I had it saved to 4 different places in the time it took him to type that response. I forwarded it to Mr. Castillo within the hour. He called me the next morning and said, with a stillness in his voice that I had come to associate with good news delivered carefully, "Emily, this is a significant development." It was because that message revealed several things at once. It revealed that Patricia and Daniel were coordinating their legal strategy together, which affected Daniel's position significantly in the context of our marriage and potential divorce proceedings. It revealed that they had discussed Harold as a potential witness and had already tried to assess and dismiss him. It revealed that they were explicitly tracking Renee's contact with me. And it revealed that Patricia believed the recording would not hold up, which meant she knew about the recording, which meant someone had told her, which narrowed the circle of who had known what and when. The hearing was still 6 weeks away, but the center of gravity had shifted. I started looking at apartments. I had been quiet about my plans, but Diane had been right. I could not remain in that house once the legal process reached its conclusion, regardless of which way things went. I found a place I liked, a small one-bedroom in a neighborhood I had always wanted to live in. Bright windows, good light in the mornings. A building with a locked mailbox and a landlord who had decent reviews. I put down a deposit using money from my personal savings account, one that had always been in my name alone. I told Daniel I was moving out 2 weeks before I actually moved. I gave him the date, I told him where I was going in general terms, I did not give him the address, he did not ask for it. We sat across from each other at the kitchen table, the same table we had eaten at for 5 years, and he said, "I didn't want it to be like this." I looked at him, I said, "I know," and that was true. He had not wanted a fight, he had wanted the thing without the fight. He had wanted me to accept the loss quietly and keep the peace. That was what he had not gotten. 2 days before I moved out, I had a conversation with Daniel that I had been preparing for without quite knowing it. We were in the kitchen and he said, "My mother made mistakes, I know that, but this doesn't have to destroy everything." He meant our marriage, he meant the life we had built. He said, "If we could just settle this without going to court." He stopped. He looked at me, and I think in that moment he finally understood that I was not going to settle, not in the way he meant. I was not going to quietly agree to a reduced portion to keep the peace. I was not going to accept a fraction of what my father intended me to have in exchange for everyone getting to walk away feeling tidy. I said, "Daniel, my father asked me to fight for it. I'm going to fight for it." He was quiet for a long time, then he said, "I should have said something when I knew what she was doing. I should have said something to you." That was the closest he ever came to an apology. It was not enough. But it was real and I kept it, the way you keep certain things, not because they fix what is broken, but because they confirm that you understood correctly what was real and what was not. I moved out on a Saturday morning. Diane helped me. We loaded my car in her car and made 2 trips. I took my clothing, my books, my personal documents, my grandmother's small jewelry box, the photo of 8-year-old me and the voice recorder. I left everything else. I left it all without ceremony. I locked the front door for the last time and put the key through the mail slot. The sound of it hitting the floor inside was quieter than I expected. Small. Final. The hearing took place 8 weeks later. I want to tell you about the room. It was not a courtroom in the dramatic sense. It was a hearing room, a long table, chairs, a judge who was really a hearing officer, attorneys on each side, and the documents spread out between us like a map of a life. My father's life, my father's handwriting, my father's voice on a recording that played through a small speaker placed in the center of the table. Patricia was there with her attorney. She wore a navy blazer and pearl earrings, and she looked across the table at me one time briefly before looking away. Harold had submitted a written affidavit. Renee had submitted her statement. The hospice records were in the file. The medical records regarding my father's condition at the relevant time were in the file. The statement from the notary was in the file. The group chat screenshot was in the file. Mr. Castillo had arranged everything carefully and completely. He had done his job the way a person does a job when they understand what it means. Patricia's attorney argued that the second will reflected Gerald's true and final wishes. He argued that the first will had been made when my father was not fully aware of his family's financial situation. He argued that the recording was ambiguous and could not be verified as entirely voluntary. He argued that Harold's account was the recollection of an elderly man who had heard part of a confused phone call. Mr. Castillo argued back. He pointed to the medical records and the medication documentation. He played the recording. He submitted the forensic analysis of the signatures, which a document examiner had noted showed signs consistent with a person in physical distress or under sedation, slightly shakier, slightly less controlled than the signatures on documents my father had signed 2 years earlier. He presented the notary's statement. He presented the group chat message, which he described as evidence of active coordination and consciousness of wrongdoing. The hearing officer read everything, asked questions, took a recess. When she came back, she said she found compelling evidence that the second document had been obtained under circumstances that could not satisfy the legal standard for a freely made and fully competent decision. She said the combination of medical evidence, the original will's clear provisions, the existence of the recording, and the circumstances of the signing process were sufficient to invalidate the competing document. She ordered the second will set aside. She ordered the original will reinstated. The house was mine, the savings account was mine, the insurance policy was mine. The storage unit, the furniture, the locked box, all of it mine. Everything my father had meant me to have, exactly as he had meant it. Patricia made a sound across the table. I did not look at her. I kept my eyes on Mr. Castillo, who was writing something on his notepad with the careful, steady hand of a person who has been here before and knows that the moment has to be received with dignity, not theatrics. I said quietly to no one in particular, "Thank you, Dad." That was all. The fallout from the hearing did not arrive all at once. It came in pieces over the following weeks, the way aftermath always does when a large thing collapses. Patricia did not speak to me. That was expected and honestly fine. What I had not expected was the silence from a wider circle, the extended family members who had watched everything happen and said nothing and now said nothing still. The cousins who had been in that group chat and had seen Patricia's mistaken message and had kept quiet. The friends of the family who had known Patricia for decades and would go on knowing her. They did not reach out. They did not congratulate me or say they were glad. They simply remained in whatever position they had been in, which was the position of people who prefer not to be involved until there is a winning side to stand beside. I did not need them to reach out. I want to say that clearly. I had stopped needing their validation somewhere in the months of that process, somewhere between Mr. Castillo's office and the parking lot of the hospice and the storage unit and the Saturday morning I drove away from a house that had never fully been mine. I had found a different kind of solid ground. Daniel and I filed for divorce 4 months after the hearing. It was not contested in the dramatic sense. We divided what needed to be divided, the attorneys communicated, I kept my apartment, he kept things we had bought together that I did not especially want. The process was tidy in the technical sense, the way a thing can be technically tidy while still being a grief of its own kind. 7 years is a long time, it is worth grieving even when the ending was the right one. Harold came to see me in my new apartment that spring. He drove up from 3 states away the same way he had driven up for my father's funeral, in his old truck with a cooler of food from his wife's kitchen and a plant she had sent for my windowsill. We sat at my small kitchen table and drank coffee and talked about my father for 3 hours. Harold told me things about my father's younger years that I had not known, stories from before I was born, stories about the man Gerald had been before he became my father. Funny things, difficult things, true things. I was grateful for every one of them. Before Harold left, he said, "He would be proud of you, Emily." He said it with the quiet authority of someone who had known my father for 60 years. I believed him. I held it carefully, the way you hold something that cannot be replaced. The house needed work. It had been sitting without full maintenance for the period of my father's illness and the legal process, and there were things that needed attention: the gutters, a window in the back bedroom, the water heater that had been making a sound for longer than it should have been making a sound. I hired people for the things I could not do myself. I did the small things myself, which was more than I expected and less than I feared. I spent weekends there through the summer. I planted things in the yard my father had mowed. I sat in the yard in the evenings and watched the light change and listened to the neighborhood he had lived in for 30 years, the dogs, the children, the ordinary sounds of people living their lives. In the fall, I rented the house. I found a family, a young couple with a toddler and a second baby on the way, the kind of family that makes a house feel used and loved and full. They signed a year lease and paid their first month in security deposit, and the husband shook my hand with both of his and said, "We're going to take good care of it." I drove home from that meeting and I cried for the first time in months, not in grief exactly, but in something that felt like release. Like a door that had been stuck finally opening all the way. The rent money goes into a savings account. I named the account after my father's initials. That is something he would have liked. Renee and I have stayed in occasional contact. Nothing heavy, nothing loaded. She sends a message sometimes, a photo of her daughter or a question about something ordinary. I respond. There is a kind of careful, honest affection between us now that did not exist before, because before it was built on a false floor, on the assumption that the family we had married into was what it presented itself to be. Now we both know the floor was false, and we are standing on something more real, even if it is smaller. Patricia has not contacted me. I do not expect her to. I do not want her to. There is nothing left between us that requires a conversation. Whatever she believed she was entitled to, whatever calculation she made when she walked into my father's house with a man and a stack of papers, she has had to live with the result of it. That is consequence. Quiet, complete, entirely sufficient consequence. I think about the version of me that sat in that attorney's office in a black dress with a wet tissue and could not speak. I think about how close it came. If I had not remembered the box, if my father had not had the presence of mind to make that recording, if Harold had not kept that phone call in his memory, if Renee had not decided to tell the truth, the margin was narrow. The margin is always narrower than it looks from the outside of a story like this. But the margin held. My father said fight for it, and I did. And I am here in my apartment on a Wednesday evening with the light coming through the window the way it does in this neighborhood that I love, writing this down so that someone who needs to hear it will hear it. What I want you to take from this is not the legal victory. The legal victory mattered, but it is not the thing that changed me. What changed me was the decision, made in a cold parking lot on the worst day of my life, to stop performing composure for people who had already shown me who they were, to stop making things comfortable for people who had made things very uncomfortable for me, to stop protecting a peace that was never really peace at all. The decision to fight was the moment I stopped being someone things happened to. That is the inheritance nobody can take. The one that does not require a document or a hearing officer or a key in a Bible. The one you claim for yourself quietly, when you decide that what was taken from you matters, that you matter, and that the people who counted on you to stay silent were wrong about you all along. My father knew what he had raised. He put it on a recording and he left it in a locked box with my name on it. He was right. Emily's story did not start with a courtroom. It started in a parking lot, cold and alone, deciding to stop being someone things happened to.